The use of espionage for the betterment of American life is seen as good and necessary, but the fact that enemies to the United States use it as well is viewed as detestable and scary. Despite the sometimes negative connotation, espionage and networks of spies have been successfully utilized for thousands of years. Spies have played a role in most major conflicts in history, both the cold and openly hostile forms of clashes. The drama of the Cold War and the paranoia of Russian spies brought much speculation and worry into the lives of the American public, and it stands as one of the most prevalent examples of espionage. However, it is not well known outside the academic arena that the American Revolution was one war that featured great militaristic leaders who leaned on intelligence networks for success. The realm of espionage was very much alive during the American Revolution, and it played a key role in both the struggles and the successes of the American campaign, providing George Washington, patriots, and the British alike with vital information. After the onset of the war, the American cause was faced with difficulty after difficulty. Although they were successful in getting the British to evacuate Boston, they were faced with hardships and defeats elsewhere. General Washington heard rumbles of discord in which some began to seek his replacement, while others even began to doubt the Patriot cause altogether. During this time, the British were able to exploit the mentality of loyalists who were faithful to the crown. Not only were they able to take advantage of popular opinion in some locations, they were also able to convince some individuals to change sides and aid the British in the war effort. Chief among those flipped by the British was Dr. Benjamin Church. Church was the Surgeon General of the United States Army, but not long into the war, Continental forces intercepted a message from Church to General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces. It was determined that Church was supplying the British with information, and he was tried, convicted, and sentenced to jail. He was eventually released but banished in 1778. However, the ship he sailed away from America on was never heard from again. Because British forces usually outnumbered the Patriots and were better trained, Washington and the American forces were usually at a disadvantage. In order to try to level the playing field, Washington needed good intelligence to discover and attack the weaknesses of the British while trying to disguise his army's own faults. Initially, scouts were heavily used as the main source of intelligence gathering, reconnoitering enemy lines and geographical terrain so as to determine when and where to attack or, in many cases, when to run. After his forces were exploited by Church, Washington began to realize that under his current strategy of only scout riders, he was very susceptible to enemy influence in his intelligence department, and he was placing himself at a disadvantage to the British. He realized that a change was necessary if they were to continue to survive and hope to win the war. Washington resolved to develop a broader scheme of espionage of his own design, through which he hoped he would be able to turn the tide of the war. Washington made sure that he oversaw and had direct communication with the spies that he recruited throughout the continent. However, it is also important to understand that Washington trusted his agents and their leaders. He allowed them to operate on their own without having to receive direct approval from himself before acting, something that gave American intelligence an advantage over the rival British. In order to institute his new strategy and give the Patriot cause a boost, George Washington began implementing small spy networks that were dependent upon civilians as well as military figures. One such network, the Culper Ring, that existed in New York has become famous recently through its portrayal on the television show Turn: Washington Spies on AMC. Many scholars have given this Long Island network of spies more attention in the last few decades as more information has surfaced about the intelligence officers and citizens that work for George Washington in the area. However, what is dramatized on television cannot be taken as pure truth, and the real historic facts must be dug up from other sources. The real figures of the Culper Ring were not as appealing as the characters on television, but they were fairly effective and a key piece to victory for the Patriots. In 1778, Major Benjamin Talmadge began intelligence operations with a new method of using civilians who were permanently placed in key locations. Talmadge disliked the old method of a Lone Ranger intelligence gatherer, which had been employed by his old friend Nathan Hale. Hale volunteered to gather intelligence in New York City after it was captured by the British, but during the mission he was caught and accused of treason. He was executed as punishment. Before he died, he exclaimed his famous words, saying, "I only regret that I have but one life to give for my country." Because Hale's story had personally impacted Talmadge, he was adamant on establishing a safer and more secure method of espionage. Talmadge returned to his hometown of Sawtucket on Long Island and began recruiting his spy ring. He started with people that he knew and was familiar with. Caleb Brewster was in the local militia and provided methods of transportation for Talmadge and his agents. Abraham Woodhull was a friend of Talmadge's, and he was established as Samuel Culper, from whom the spy ring gets its name. Anna Strong was also brought into the ring to help with signaling and act as a middleman of sorts. She was one of the many women engaged in efforts of spying for Americans throughout the colonies. Woodhull would travel into New York City under the guise that he was visiting his sister, but instead he would gather information about troop numbers and movements. He would bring this information back to Sawtucket, and through Strong and Brewster, the information would reach Talmadge and eventually General Washington. This method worked for some time, but eventually the British became suspicious and even attempted to arrest Woodhull. Seeing the growing problem, Woodhull sought out more help for the ring, and he acquired the assistance of Robert Townsend, a local merchant in New York City. Townsend had many reasons to be in New York City, so his presence there was not suspicious, and he became known as Samuel Culper, Jr. He gathered very useful naval information which made its way back to Long Island and Woodhull. Washington was very impressed with the work of the Culper Ring, and his writings seemed to show his admiration for their skill and dedication to the cause. Alexander Rose wrote a book on the Culper Ring in which he examined the papers of George Washington, and he reveals the interesting struggle that existed inside Washington's head over remaining a gentleman, but engaging in acts of espionage which were not seen as acts of a gentleman. Washington realized that intelligence was necessary if the Americans were to win the war, so he put his personal convictions aside for the greater good of the glorious cause. The efforts and methods of spy rings were very delicate and particular. The members of the Culper Ring could not just simply walk into a tavern in New York City frequented by British regulars, write down the information they overheard, and return to Long Island to pass on their message. Many search points and eyes full of suspicion were watching for such activities in New York, so they had to develop methods to disguise their true purpose. As stated before, Woodhull used the guise of visiting his sister to enter New York, but in order to get the information out, science and codes were heavily employed. Woodhull and Townsend used invisible ink to write their messages, which they could place in between lines of personal correspondence, or make it seem like they were simply carrying a blank piece of paper. In order to reveal the ink, a reagent was applied to read the message. Additionally, Talmadge developed a cipher code book, which established 3-digit numbers representing common words, places, or people. This code book was distributed to Townsend and Washington, and combined with the invisible ink, allowed the Culper Ring to operate safely with minimal risk of discovery. Anna Strong was also known to hang clothes a certain way on the clothesline when information was ready to be collected, or she would even hang a certain color garment to signal to other members of the ring. The efforts of the Culper Ring provided Washington with a constant flow of numbers for troops and their movements, but this information was very mundane and really had little impact. It wasn't until 1780 when they discovered that the British planned to attack the French forces that had recently arrived to support the Americans before they could establish good defenses, that their efforts proved to be very impactful. Armed with the information passed to him through Talmadge, Washington was able to maneuver his troops as if to attack Manhattan, distracting the British and allowing the French to avoid being attacked. Other than this instance, the intelligence gathered by the Culper Ring was not spectacular, but it allowed Washington to have great situational awareness of British operations in and around their headquarters in New York City. Unlike many of the small domestic rings, like the Culper Ring, most individuals have heard of the exploits of Benedict Arnold and are familiar with his role as a trader during the late 18th century in America. Although Arnold fought valiantly for the Patriot cause through the 1770s, he was persuaded to begin working for the British by Major John Andre. Benedict Arnold's courage and valor on the battlefield were instrumental in victories at Ticonderoga and Saratoga while serving the Americans. But after suffering multiple injuries and being passed over for promotion multiple times by Congress, his drive for independence wavered. By 1780, Major John Andre was in charge of British secret intelligence, and he sought out Arnold because he knew of the discontent he held for American leadership. Arnold agreed to hand over West Point to the British, which he had just taken command of in 1780 for the sum of £20,000. This value would be equivalent to over $1 million in today's money. By taking West Point, the British would divide New England and be able to cut the American rebellion in half. But the plot was discovered before it could be carried out. Andre was captured by militiamen following a secret rendezvous with Arnold near West Point, and the papers he had on his person made Americans suspicious of Arnold. It was Major Benjamin Talmadge, the overseer of the Culper Ring, who provided the evidence to General Washington that Arnold was involved, using information that was gathered by Abraham Woodhull and his connections. However, Benedict escaped and fought for the British for the rest of the war. John Andre was not so lucky. He was tried, convicted, and executed for treason. In this case, Washington's efforts in espionage, along with some good luck, allowed the intelligence gathered to expose a serious threat to the American war effort before it was too late. Andre's image, in the eyes of Americans, was among the first enemy spies to be viewed with hatred and rage, a viewpoint that would carry on through modern times with modern spies. Codes and ciphers have improved over the years, but American espionage finds its roots in the American Revolution. Far beyond invisible ink and code books, today's use of technology makes the Culper Ring pale in comparison, but it is important to understand that their brave efforts were very influential to the Patriot cause and impacted George Washington directly. Washington was inspired by the efforts of the Culper Ring and others, who far surpassed his expectations, and they gave him faith that the American fight would endure and win the war. Although not typically known for being the spymaster that he actually was, General Washington's methods and ideas allowed Talmadge and other agents to successfully gather intelligence for the Americans. The Culper Ring was only one of many small networks that were established throughout the war effort and that spanned the entire area of battle. Washington realized that civilian influence and oversight were just as important to government as military might, and through his spy networks, this was achieved. Despite the advantages gathered through intelligence networks during the Revolutionary War, the practice of espionage mostly disappeared after the war and did not resurface until well into the 19th century. Overall, intelligence networks played a vital role in the Revolutionary War for both sides. The British utilized secrecy and deception, but they were outplayed by the Americans, whose networks, such as the Culper Ring, provided vital intelligence that allowed George Washington and the Patriots to push on to victory and complete independence.